Hi, my name is Alyssa Ward. My client for my behavior change project was a 6-year-old male diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder who was referred to the ABA clinic where I work for social deficits, deficits in functional communication, and problematic behaviors. He is preparing to transition to school in fall of 2016. Therefore, I chose the target behavior of group disruptive behavior. Group disruptive behavior is defined as any behavior that causes or could cause the other members of the group or the group leader to turn their attention away from the instruction and to the client. This was targeted for reduction because when my client goes to school, he will need to know how to sit quietly, attend to the teacher, and not disrupt his peers in that learning environment. This will give him the best learning environment possible. So, group disruptive behavior could be anything from humming, clapping, screaming, kicking, hitting the table, and it was broken down into high intensity and low intensity behavior in the treatment and return to baseline condition. So high intensity behavior was any behavior that causes or could cause all the members or the majority of the members to turn their attention away from the instruction and to the client. This included screaming, clapping, kicking the table, but wouldn't include humming to oneself or talking underneath one's breath. These would be characterized as low intensity behaviors, behaviors that cause or could cause only the client's general neighbors in his vicinity to be disruptive and turn their attention away from the group. The measurement I used was partial interval recording. I chose this. Initially I was going to choose duration recording, but it proved to be too difficult. His behaviors were sometimes extremely quick, and it was hard to track the duration, and sometimes it was hard to hear when the behavior started and when it ended. So partial interval recording seemed to be easier and provided a more accurate representation. I broke down the 30-minute group session into 30-second intervals. At each interval, at the end, you would put a plus in the box if the behavior occurred or a minus in the box if it did not occur. If it did occur, a H or an L for high intensity or low intensity would be placed in the box for the treatment and return to baseline condition. The group mimicked a typical morning school routine. So the clients came in, they did attendance, they learned about the calendar, talked about the weather, sang songs, things that typical kids in school do. I used a reversal design for this project. I programmed for an AB-AB design, but due to the variability in my data and the results, only an ABA design was used. And this was used because it was only implemented in one setting, and I thought it would give a good representation of the effect the social story would have on the behavior. So the baseline for this procedure, before transitioning, the therapist, Len, my client, has 2 therapists whom he works with, one Monday, Wednesday, Friday, one on Tuesdays and Thursday. So both therapists took the data, depending on what day. For baseline, they would just tell him it's time to go to the resource room. They wouldn't tell him why. They transition, they'd sit down and begin recording the data as soon as the group leader begins group by giving the first instruction. They had a stopwatch to record the 30-second intervals and took the data if the behavior did or did not occur. The behavior was ignored by the therapist and the group leader. For the treatment condition, an individualized social story was written for Len, and it described what was expected of him in group, what behaviors were necessary, what he got when he engaged in those behaviors, and pictures that depicted sitting nicely, having quiet hands, having a quiet mouth. So before transitioning, the therapist would say, okay, Len, it's time to go to the resource room for group. So he knew what he was going to the resource room for. Before getting into the resource room, they stopped outside the door, read the story, walked in, transitioned, sat down, and began recording the duration once the group leader started group. Same partial interval recording like baseline. The behavior again was ignored. Differential reinforcement was provided by the group leader in all conditions for all the clients if they were sitting nicely, working appropriately, and attending to the instructor. IOA was recorded for all the stages, all the phases. For the first baseline, 40% of the sessions IOA was conducted in, 2 sessions per therapist. The mean was 96% agreement with a range of 94 to 98%. For the treatment, 33% of the sessions IOA was conducted, 3 sessions per therapist. The range was 94 to 96% with a mean of 95% agreement. Baseline, the return to baseline, 40% was conducted, 40% of the sessions, and 1 per therapist. The range was 95 to 96%, and the mean 95.5%. So the results indicated that there was no effect of the social story of intervention on the behavior. There was extreme variability in the data, as you can see from this graph. All conditions, all phases had extreme variability. This is the disruptive behavior by magnitude, and as you can see here, this is the high intensity disruption, that's the low intensity disruption, and this was during baseline. Low intensity increased and high intensity decreased during the return to baseline, even though the intervention wasn't in effect. So generalization was programmed into this by having generalization across people, because different people read the story, different people ran the group. It was programmed to be generalized across settings if the behavior change occurred, so it would have been implemented in 2 other settings in 2 other different groups. Briefly, I want to discuss the variables of why this intervention didn't work. The variability in the data, there were a lot of different correlations that we saw. The high peaks were correlated with peers engaging in high intensity disruption, so loud screaming, physical aggression, and this is when other therapists, other adults would come into the room and give attention to another peer. Also, there was a high correlation between disruptive behavior and the amount of adults in the room. In addition, the group leader also had some correlation between when he engaged and with whom he engaged in the behaviors and with whom he didn't. If you were more engaging and more fun during the group, he would engage in less disruptive behavior. Also, his home life was very disrupted right when we started this program. His father ended up leaving, who he had lived with his whole life, and him and his mother are in the middle of a move, so that also could have had some effect on the behavior. Thank you.